Okay. All right, good morning, everybody. Today's daf is Daf Yud Tes. The sponsorships for today, we have our annual Talmud Torah sponsor from Tilson family as a schus for B'suras Tovas for Am Yisrael. The Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Nisan. Paul Pollack in celebration of the Nisan birthdays of his wife Kathy and his granddaughter Tikva Esther Pollack of West Orange, and the birth of a grandson to Ida and Jeremiah Pollack of Indianapolis, Indiana. We have an anonymous sponsor in the schus of Simchos for all of our children, and for Nisan to be the month of Geula Shlema for Klal Yisrael, and Avram and Shandy Kelman in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Brian Abbas Yehoshua Heschel, whose yard site is on the 29th of Nisan. Neshama should have an aliyah. There are other sponsorships that I missed. I apologize. I don't know if there are daily sponsorships, but we'll put in the notes if I missed anything. Okay, so we're going to pick up on the last line of Yud Ches Amud Beis. Is that where we left off? Somewhat? Okay. Close enough. We got up to the top? Okay. All right. So the Gemara says, Amar of Ada, Amar of Yitzchak, Bikurim Emasai Mechavin Alehem. So we were talking about before that for a zar, for a non-Kohen eating Bikurim, we have Chiyav Misa B'dei Shemayim. So we say, when is the point where a non-Kohen who eats Bikurim will become Chayav? We say, Mishiyaru Pnei Habayis. It has to be only once the Bikurim have already seen, they've already gone into, past the threshold, and therefore they have this kedusha, and only afterwards do they would someone who eats with a non-kohen who eats it have a chiyuv misa. So you say, and where do we know that? Bram ki yatana detanya. Be'ezer omer bikurim miktsasam b'chutz miktsasam bifnim. Let's say you have bikurim that are they're partially over the threshold and partially still outside the threshold. So shebachutz, those parts of the bikurim that are still outside, harein kechulin, they're treated like chulin. And the first understand it's not actually chulin. There still would be an isser, but it doesn't have the chiyuv misa, so they're still considered chulin from that perspective. But shebefnim, and those that have already crossed the threshold, harehen kehegdish l'chol devreim, they already are now treated like hegdish. So we see here that depending on once the fruits cross the threshold, would they have the full isser, and therefore we understand that you only want bishiyara penebais. Okay. Amrav Sheshis. Now we go back to something we've been discussing over the past couple of days, is when there are two parts, or two main components of when we bring the Bikurim, is first they need to be brought and placed on the side of the Mizbeach, and there are also a series of psukim that need to be read with the mitzvah of Bikurim. So Rav Sheshis comes along and he says, Bikurim, Hanacha ma'akev esben. What is ma'akev? What is essential to the mitzvah of the bikurim would be to go and place them next to the mizbeach. However, kriya ena ma'akev esben. However, the reading of the psukim, it's something that you're supposed to do as part of the mitzvah. But if it's not done, it doesn't invalidate all of the bikurim. Right. So come on, who's this opinion like? Kiyata Tanya. So we bring a brisa that supports this view. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Shlosha Dvarim Mishum Shlosha Zakenim. So the Brisa talks about Rabbi Yossi brings down three different memras from three different Zakenim. And Rashi points out it's a longer Brisa. We're not going to quote all of them. We're only going to quote, which I think is actually the third memra that is relevant to our discussion here, which is in the name of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Yochel Ya'ala Adam Meiser Sheni Bizman Hazeh B'Yerushalayim V'Yochelenu. I might have thought that nowadays when we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, that still the Meiser Sheni can be brought inside of the walls of Yerushalayim and still be eaten, even though there's no Beis HaMikdash. Maybe the din of Meiser Sheni would still exist, and we'd still be able to bring it into Yerushalayim and eat it. So that would be the Havamina. The din we say no. We have a lima that teaches otherwise. Bechor tan hava'as makom, u'Meiser Sheni tan hava'as makom. We make a connection, make a hakesh. Their mitzvah of Bechor requires bringing it to a certain place. For Bechor, it's different. It has to be brought actually inside of the Beis HaMikdash. And Meiser Sheni also has a designated place that it has to be brought, which is namely inside of Yerushalayim. And since they both have this idea, this halacha, that they have to be brought to a specific place to be eaten, we make the connection. So we say, what? Ma Bechor eino ela b'fnei habayis. Just like the mitzvah of Bechor is only going to be noheg when the Beis Hamikdash is standing. Af meiser eno el b'fnei habayis. So to meiser sheni, we're only going to be noheg it when the Beis Hamikdash is around. And at this point, the Rabbi Yishmael is taking for granted that we know we understand for sure that with the mitzvah of Bechor, you have to have a Beis Hamikdash. Gemara is later on going to question that or ask where that source is, but for now, the assumption is we know that Bechor only is noheg when a Beis Hamikdash is, and we're going to learn from a Bechor to Meiser Sheni that it's also only going to be noheg when the Beis Hamikdash is standing. So, but now the Gemara asks, or the Brisa continues to bring down, well, we can't necessarily learn straight Bechor to Meiser Sheni because there's a difference. Mala Bechor shekein ta'un matan damim ve'emurin l'gavim mizbeach. So Bechor has something that is a stringency, right? That the Bechor can only be brought when you have, a Bechor requires sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach and take the emurim and be makriv them on the mizbeach. So we see that Bechor has a stringency that Meiser Sheni doesn't have, and therefore we can't learn that just because Bechor requires the Beis Hamikdash to be built in order to bring it, that Meiser Sheni has the same din. So we say, no, Bikurim yochichu. Well, okay, fine, we can't learn it from Bechor, but Bikurim will disprove it, because Bikurim do not record, they don't have blood applications, obviously, in the Bikurim, and there isn't a requirement to burn anything on the Mizbeach. So we see the Bikurim will prove that just like Bikurim would only be brought when there is a Beis Hamikdash, so too Meiser Sheni. So the Gemara says, no, Mala Bikurim shekein tu'unen hanacha. But Bikurim have a stringency of their own, that what do they need? They need to be placed next to the Mizbeach. We already see where the proof is coming from, but we'll continue to quote a little bit before we get back there. So Tamalomer, instead, so how do we learn out then this din of Meiser Sheni that is only noheg when the Beis Hamikdash is standing? Because we say, the Pasuk says, and what is the list of what you can eat only in front of the Beis Hamikdash? So we see that both Meiser Sheni and Bechor are included in the pasuk, and once the pasuk links them together, we can't then use the same questions, the same paracha that we had before, because the pasuk is showing us that there's a linkage. So we have more leeway in terms of connecting them for their halachos, even if there are certain differences, because the pasuk now put them together. So we ended up learning from the Hekesh that the pasuk connects them, and therefore, just like Bechor requires Beis Hamikdash to be standing, so too Meiser Sheni requires the Beis Hamikdash to be standing. So Makish Meiser leBechor, B'Bechor Eino Ela L'Fnei Habayis, Af Meiser Eino Ela L'Fnei Habayis. Okay. So now we go to our proof. That's the part we quote from the Brisa. Now we come with our proof, because we brought this originally to teach us that the din of Rav Sheshes, that hanacha, right, that Bikurim hanacha me'akeves, right, we were talking about Meiser Sheni and Bechor, but really we brought it down for a proof from Bikurim, or to bring a proof to Bikurim, right? Rav Sheshes told us that Bikurim, the hanacha, the placing it next to Mizbeach is ma'akev, that's essential, but the kriya of the psukim is not essential. And so what's the proof? So the im isa, if it was the case that not only is placing the Bikurim essential, but also reading the Psukim, then when we brought down in the middle of our Shakla V'Tarya, when we brought down, we tried to bring Bikurim in as a proof, and we said, Bikurim is different because the Hanacha is required, Hanacha next to Mizbeach. So the Imisa, if not only the Hanacha is essential, but also the Kriya is essential, then Lifrach Mal Bikurim Shekin Tu'unin Kriya V'Hanacha. Then it should have said, what's the difference with Bikurim? Bikurim require placing them next to the Mizbeach and reading the Psukim. The fact that the Brisa only brought down that it was Hanacha, that is something that's differentiating by Bikurim, it shows that the Hanacha is the only thing that's essential. So Amar Rashi says, no, that's not a good proof. Why? Hidi Ikuva Leka, even according to both opinions, right? Even according to the opinion of Rav Sheshes, that Kriya is not Ma'aki by Bikurim, he still holds that there's a mitzvah of Kriya of the Psukim. He doesn't hold that that's not part of the mitzvah. It's just that it's not an essential part that's ma'akev, the full mitzvah Bikurim. So he said, right, he the ikuva leka, mitzvah mileka. So there still would be a mitzvah according to all opinions, velema, and then the Brisa should have said, mitzvah of livrach. It should have said, what's the difference with Bikurim? Bikurim, there is an essential issue of Hanacha and a mitzvah of Kriya, and both of those should have been mentioned. So the fact that it didn't mention the Kriya of the Psukim at all shows that there's some other reason why the Kriyas Psukim is not brought down in the Brisa, not because they're not essential. So we deflect the proof. So El Amar Rashi then just explains to us why did the Brisa not bring down anything about the Kriya of the Psukim by Bikurim. He says, Di'ika Bikuria Ger, because while the Hanacha, placing down the Bikurim, is uniform and consistent according to anyone who's bringing Bikurim, when in certain circumstances there is no mitzvah of Kriya Psukim by Bikurim. Which is that case? The case of Bikurim that are brought by a ger. Why? Remember, one of the Psukim that need to be said with the bringing of the Bikurim is Asher Nishpa Hashem La'avoseinu. That Hashem promised to this land that Hashem promised to our fathers, and a ger doesn't have that lineage that traces all the way back, and therefore Lo Matzi Amar he can't say it. So Lo Psikale. So in that case, that's the reason why the Brisa didn't bring down the discussion of Kriya Psukim and only the discussion of Hanacha. Okay, so now we go back. Now we've deflected, or we've said this is not going to be a proof to Rav Shesha's opinion, but now we're going to go back and break down a few parts of the Brisa that we brought. So if we look back, when the Brisa tried to bring a proof of why you may bring, right, of Meiser Sheni, that can only be brought when there is a Beis HaMikdash. So first we tried from Bechor, unsuccessfully. Then we tried from Bikurim unsuccessfully, and then we went on to a separate Hekesh from the pasuk. So the Gemara asks, what's our usual pattern if we say we try to bring the proof from A and we get deflected? We say, okay, what about B? B disproves it. What's the next logical step that the Gemara usually brings down? Okay, let's try to bring A and B together, right, from a tzad hashava. So the Gemara asks, V'lihader dina v'teisi b'mahatzad. Why wasn't the next step to bring down and say, okay, we can't learn it straight from Bechor. We can't learn it straight from Bikurim. Let's learn it from Bechor and Bikurim together as a tzad hashava. So he said, no, di'ikal mefrach malat tzad hashava shebehen shekain yesh behen tzad mizbeach. So that wouldn't have worked, because even though they each had different stringencies, they each had some connection to the mizbeach. Whether it was a connection of having the sprinkling of the blood or burning on the mizbeach, or just placing next to the mizbeach, both of those had a connection to the mizbeach, where Meiser Sheni doesn't have a specific connection to the mizbeach, but just Yerushalayim as a whole. Right? Okay. And now, so now we're going to go back. So now the question we had talked about originally was, we had the Rabbi Shmuel had assumed or had taken for granted that everybody agrees, or it's obvious that a Bechor, to bring Bechor, you have to have a Beis HaMikdash. So now we ask, why is this so obvious to Rabbi Shmuel? What does he hold? If he holds that the original Kedusha Yerushalayim, right, the Makkos that we have all throughout Shas, whether when the Beis HaMikdash was built and the Yerushalayim was originally sanctified, does that Kedusha now last forever, even though we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, the Kedusha still remains? Or do we say that once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, that Kedusha ended, and we need a new Beis HaMikdash to reinvigorate that Kedusha? So he's saying, if Rabbi Shmuel holds that Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Shaisa v'Kitchel Asalavo, so therefore the Kedusha of Yerushalayim is still intact, so then Afilu Bechor, Nami, then in that case, if the Kedusha is still intact, then the bringing of the Bechor should still be allowed, because the Kedusha is still there. So why not bring? Why are we saying that a Bechor cannot be brought unless it's the Beis HaMikdash if the Kedusha still stands? Right? Why are we only worried about Meiser Sheni? We should have understood that Bechor definitely can be brought. Or but if we hold that the Kedusha is no longer there, and therefore because the Kedusha is no longer there, we had a question. Okay, so Meiser Sheni, does it need that Kedusha? And therefore because the Kedusha is not there anymore, we can't bring the Meiser Sheni. Or maybe the Meiser Sheni doesn't require the Kedusha of the Mizbeach, and therefore it can still be brought. That was the question. That's why we weren't sure we needed limud. In that case, Afilu Bechor Nami Tibai. Why don't we should ask the question? It shouldn't be obvious to us on Bechor. Bechor should have the same question. That does Bechor necessarily require the Kedusha to be there, and therefore there's no Kedusha, no Bechor? Or is Bechor something that could still be brought even though there's no kedusha, right? Why don't we need a limud to teach us one way or another? So Ravina says no. La'olam kasavar kitchelashaisa velo kitchelasadlava. So no, really he holds that the kedusha is no longer there, and so why was it obvious to him that a bechor cannot be brought? Right, what we brought down is bechor. Everybody agrees it's obvious cannot be brought without the Beis Hamikdash. So he said we have a specific case here. Hacha bechor shenizrak damo kodem chorban habayis. So we have a very specific case here where the Bechor was brought, the blood was sprinkled, there was a Mizbech, there was a Beis Hamikdash, and then the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash happened in between the sprinkling of the blood and the eating of the animal and bringing the basar on the Mizbech. So therefore now what do we have? We have a Bechor whose blood was sprinkled on the Mizbech because the Mizbech was around, and now it's sitting there, there's no more Mizbech, but you have a bechor that needs to be eaten. And what do we say? Umakshinan b'sar l'damo. We have a hekesh from the basar of the bechor to the dam, just like the dam was sprinkled. Ma damo b'mizbeach. Once the dam was sprinkled on the mizbeach itself, apasar b'mizbeach. Now the basar requires mizbeach, and therefore it can't be eaten. So it's obvious in this particular case that you can't eat this bechor because since the blood was sprinkled on the mizbeach, it now connects the entire animal to the mizbeach, and you can't eat it. So it was obvious, the Bechor case, and then we were able to learn to the Meiser Sheni case. And then finally, Umakish Meiser Bechor. Once we know Bechor can't be eaten, then we did the Hekesh that we had from our Pasuk, that Bechor as well, that Meiser Sheni as well cannot be eaten without the mizbeach. So the Gemara asked on this limud, once we have original limud from Hekesh, in this case we said we were makish the dam to the basar of the bechor, and once we have a principle in kachim that you can make one limud, but you can't have a daisy chain of one limud and then a limud to another limud. And therefore, once we made the Hekesh from dam to basar, how can we then go and make the Hekesh of bechor to meiser? So the Gemara says, no, it's Meiser Dagon Chulani, right? The principle of not making a Hekesh and a Hekesh only is within Kachim. So we agree that Bechor is Kachim, but Meiser Sheni is grain, it's Chulin. So Meiser Sheni is Chulin, and therefore we can make one Hekesh and then another Hekesh because we're making it one within Kachim, and then the next one within Chulin. Turn to Amud Beis. So we say, Hanicha Laman Damar Basar Laman Azlinan. So this makes sense. I understand this answer based on the opinion who says we go by the source that is being learned to, right? In any Hekesh, you have the source and then, or the Milamed and the Lamed. So if you're talking about the secondary source, which in this case is Meiser Sheni, okay, then we only have Kachim in one end, and we have Chulin on the other end. However, El Lamanda Amar Basar Milamed Azinin. But if we're saying that when we categorize the Hekesh, we look at where the limud is coming from, well then we have Dam, which is Kachim, Basar of the Bechor, which is Kachim. Those are the two, and then we have Kachim and Kachim. We shouldn't be able to do Hekesh and another Hekesh. And then we have this, then we still have that issue. So Michael, remember what do you say? Rather we say Dam the Basar Chadamilsi. So we have to say is that this principle, when we say Hekesh to Hekesh, applies when we're talking about two different things. So let's say you would learn from Bechor to another set of Kachim, a totally different something within Kachim, and then want to learn again, that's when we are not able to. But in this case, yes, we said it's a Hekesh, Basar, and Dam, but they're both within the same animal. They're both the Bechor. So we're not considering that like a separate entity. It's one, and then we're only making one Hekesh from that full entity of the Dam and the Basar together, and we're making that Limud to Meiser Sheni, and therefore it will be allowed. Okay, now we move on. We're going back to analyze in the Gemara. The Gemara said, Kachay Kachim. The Gemara continued to give a list of Chiyuvei Makkos, and this will start with Kachay Kachim. We're actually going to talk about the rest of that list was Meiser Sheni, but that Meiser Sheni, eating Meiser Sheni, you would get Makkos for. And the Gemara asked, Tani Nachadazim, we already learned this. We already had this in the earlier Mishnah about Meiser Sheni, which said Meiser Sheni v'hegdesh shaloniftu. If you have Meiser Sheni or hegdesh that was not poda and you eat it, there's a chiyuv malchus. So why do we need to teach this law again? Why do we need to add Meiser Sheni to the list once more? Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, he says no. There's two different cases we're talking about. Seifa the Meiser Sheni tahar, the gavra tahar. In the secondary, this case that we brought down in our latest Mishnah, we're talking about a case where we have Meiser Sheni that is fully tahor, a person that is fully tahor, and dekachos l'chutz l'choma, but you're eating it outside of the walls of Yerushalayim, and that's the issa that we're talking about here. But Reisha, the first instance we brought that Meiser Sheni, was talking about Meiser Sheni Tameh v'Gavra Tameh. That was talking about when we had a problem with the Meiser Sheni or with the individual. One of them was Tameh, the Ka'achile bi Yerushalayim, and that's a case where even if you're eating Meiser Sheni properly within the walls of Yerushalayim, you still have an Isser Makkos because either the Meiser Sheni itself was Tameh or the person was Tameh. So even though we're both cases of Meiser Sheni, they're different cases. So we're asking, Minale the Mechayev Aleh Mishum Toma. How do we know that Meiser Sheni would be Chayev Makkos in a case of Meiser Sheni where there is Tumah involved? Again, whether the Tumah is within the Meiser Sheni itself or the Tumah is with the Gabra. So Tanya with Brisa Rabbi Shimon Omer, we have the lashon of the vidui meiser lo bi'arti mimenu b'tameh. So when part of the vidui meiser that is said, a person says, I didn't destroy it. In this case, destroying means eating. Lo bi'arti mimenu b'tameh. I didn't do it while I was tameh, and that's bein she'ani tameh v'hutar, bein she'ani tar v'hutameh. Whether it's a case where the person was tameh and the meiser sheni was tahar, or the person was tahar, but the Meiser Sheni was tameh. In both those cases, we see that there's an Isser based on the vidui, and therefore that's where we see the source of Meiser Sheni. That's where we see that there is an Isser of Meiser Sheni being eaten b'tumah. So then the Gemara asks, "V'heichon fine." That we see that it's in the lashon of the vidu. V'heichon mosar al achila. How do we know? Where do we see the source where the achila is? Sir, any odem. So the Bride says, I don't know. I don't know where that source is. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean? I don't know. Tumas haguf bejiksiv. Tumas haguf is written straight out. We have straight psukim that show us that if somebody is tamei and they eat ma'aser sheni that is tahar, that they would be chayev. What's the pasuk? Nefesh asher sigabo, any person that touches the meiser, v'tama ad ha'arav, you're tamei until the evening, and you can't eat from it. So we see from the pasuk that we have, clear indication that if you have a person who is tamei, they can't eat meiser sheni, which is tar. Ella tumas atzmo minayin. Okay, fine. So that gives us the source for when the person is tamei and the meiser sheni is tar. What about the opposite case, where the meiser sheni itself is tamei but the person is tahor? So minayin tiksiv lo suchal le'achol b'sharecha. So we have a pasuk that tells us lo suchal le'achol b'sharecha ma'asar diganacha v'sirshcha v'yitzarecha v'chos b'chov v'tzarecha v'chos arecha shedidor. So we see the pasuk talking about meiser sheni, that you can't eat it. But then we have a different pasuk, b'sharecha tochelenu atameh v'hatahar, where we specifically say that a tamei and tahor person can eat together. So in that case, what's happening? If you have a tamei and a tahor person eating together, what's going to happen? Inevitably, the meat's going to become tamei, and then the tahor person is going to be eating basar tamei, and we see that is prohibited. However, lo suchal, but that is permitted. B'sharecha tochel, and you're allowed to eat it, but we juxtapose that with a case of meiser, which says lo suchal lechal b'sharecha, and therefore we see by meiser it's not allowed, even though in other cases it is allowed to have a tamei and a tahor person eating them together. V'tani deber b'shmal afilo tamei v'tar ochlim b'ka'ar achas v'ein choshin v'kamar rachmana hayach tamer d'shari l'cha gabe tahar hasam. Right, sorry. I said it outside, but this is the Gemara saying inside, which is the case that you're allowed to eat together. Awesome. Hacha, but lo suchal. But in our case, lo suchal. Okay, fine. So now that we've discussed or brought up Meiser Sheni, we're going to talk about a couple of different halachos within Meiser Sheni. So we ask, uminalan debar pediyahu, how do we know that Meiser Sheni is allowed to be podeh, and this case is even inside Yerushalayim? Sorry, we're talking about specifically Meiser Sheni that is tamei, that can be podeh inside Yerushalayim. So Meiser Sheni shenitma shepodeh so afilu b'Yerushalayim. Talmud lomar kilo suchal se'eso. It says you're not allowed to bring it up, and se'eso really means to carry it. But what's the limit here? Ein se'eso el achila. In this case, we're talking about se'eso being achila, being the eating of it. Shenamar vayisam asos me'es banav. And therefore, we see that if you cannot have, since you cannot eat it, there's when are you allowed to usually poda Meiser Sheni? When it's outside Yerushalayim. Why? Because you're not allowed to eat it there. You're in a place where it's not allowed to be eaten because you're outside the walls of Yerushalayim. And therefore we allow you to be poda it. So then, the limit here is that another case where you're allowed to be poda it is where there's a problem with eating it, so which is inside Yerushalayim when it's tamei. Since you're not allowed to eat it, it's as if it's connected to not being able to bring it up. And since it's not edible at this point because it's tamei, we allow you to be poda. So that's the limud that even Meiser Sheni that is in Yerushalayim, which usually you're no longer allowed to be poda. If it's tamei, you can be poda. Now, Amar Bibi, Amar Vasi, another halacha of Meiser Sheni. B'nai l'Meiser Sheni tahar. Okay, now we talk about Pidyon Meiser Sheni. What if you have Meiser Sheni that is tahar, good Meiser Sheni? If you're well outside Yerushalayim, no problem. You could always be poda. That's straight from the Pesukim. What about you are literally like one step away? You're right at the threshold of Yerushalayim. Can you still be poda that Meiser Sheni? So he said, we bring the same pasuk. Suchal se'eso, right? Because when are you allowed to be poda Meiser Sheni? When you are unable to bring it up to eat it, right? Right. So we say pasuk. In this case, you're still outside. You're technically still outside Yerushalayim, and therefore you can be podet. So you say no. We just used this limud before to teach us of being podet meiser sheni that's tamei, inside Yerushalayim. So imkain. So we say okay, you're right, but imkain lemakra lo sucha laochlo. What should the pasuk have said? Why use the word say so? It should have just said you're not allowed to eat it, right? Because once you're in Yerushalayim and you're allowed to eat it, you no longer can be poda it. As long as it's not yet subject to achila, you can be poda it. However, my say so. Why does the pasuk specifically say the word say so? It's there that we can use two limudim. So we use a lashon that could be carrying, could be eating, and we can learn both halachos from it. So the ema kulo lahachi. So why do we say, okay, so then let's say, all right, well, let's only learn this limud of the achila. Okay, then if it's only about carrying it in, then it should say you can't carry it. My say so, right? So the fact that we learn this halacha, the fact that the pasuk uses the lashon say so, which can be read either or, we're able to learn both halachas, both that you can poda it just outside Yerushalayim for tahar meiser sheni, and you can be poda inside Yerushalayim for tamei meiser sheni. Either one is acceptable for pidyon. It's Ramin Atarti. So, Yosef Rav Chanina, Rav Hosha, V'koy Bailei, Apischa Yerushalayim Mahu. So Rav Chanina and Rav Hosha were sitting and learning, and they asked, okay, what about if you're literally in the threshold of Yerushalayim? You're literally through the entranceway of Yerushalayim. Mahu. So Pshita, it's a case hu b'chutz. If it's a case where you're like carrying it in front of you, you're carrying your Meiser Sheni in front of you, and therefore the Meiser Sheni has crossed the threshold, but you have not yet crossed the threshold, then kaltu mechitzos. Then in that case, it's obvious that you can no longer be poda because the Meiser Sheni has crossed the actual Meiser Sheni, even though you haven't, has crossed the threshold, and therefore it's no longer subject to pidyon. What about the other case? What about hu bifnim umaso b'chutz? Let's say you've crossed, but you're carrying it like in a sack on your back, or you have like a backpack of it, and you've crossed over, so your body is inside the walls, but the Meiser Sheni is technically outside the walls, and then you stop there. Can you now still be poda? You're inside, but the Meiser Sheni is outside. Now, what's the case? That's the question they were asking. So Tanu Lahu Saba B'Dver Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. The pasuk says Ki Yirchak Mimecha HaMakom, that the place is far from you, Yerushalayim is far from you, Mimulo Secha, and therefore it has to be your completeness. So in this case, the fact that you've already brought yourself in, even though the Meiser is not, you drag the Meiser along with you, and therefore just once you cross the threshold, the Meiser Sheni also can no longer be poda. So Bayer of Papa asks the next step in this question. What if nakele bekanya? What if instead of it being like on your person, you have like you have like a stick, let's say, or something holding it, and the Meiser Sheni is attached to a sack in the back. So you're holding it, but it's no right when it's like on your back. It's part of your person. It can be considered part of your person. But what if you now have like another level removed where you're holding a stick or something that's in, and then connected to that in the back is the Meiser Sheni? So in that case, Teku. In that case, we say Teku. We don't have an answer. We don't know if in that case it's dragged along with the body or not. Okay, we can go. Try to go a little further. Amar Basi, Amar B'Yochanan. Meiser Sheni me'emes ha'chavin alav. So now we ask Meiser Sheni, when is somebody going to be chayav for eating Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim? Mishira Penei Choma. It's only once that Meiser Sheni has actually gone and been inside and then brought outside. That's when you have the full chiyuv. My time, Tamar Kra, L'fnei Hashem Elokecha Tochlenu Shana V'Shana Uksiv Lo Suchal Le'achol B'Sha'arecha. So we say first that you have to bring it in front of Yerushalayim, L'fnei Hashem Elokecha, and also Lo Suchal Le'achol B'Sha'arecha. But you're not allowed to eat it in your own area outside Yerushalayim. So Kol Echa Dekarina Bei L'fnei Hashem Elokecha Tochlenu. Only once you can say it has risen to the level of then it learns back on not being able to eat it outside of Yerushalayim. But if you cannot yet say that it's Lefnei Hashem Elokecha, then you cannot say that. Then you can't yet say that you don't yet have the isser of eating it outside. So it's essentially. The Meiser Sheni has to first become in a state where it's a roy lachil that it crosses in, and then it comes back out, and then you have the issue of eating. But before then, you wouldn't have the chiyuv. It's really for the chiyuv Makkos. You wouldn't have the chiyuv Makkos for eating the Meiser Sheni. I think we'll stop here before we get. I think we're going to stop. We'll stop here. Pick up here tomorrow. Yeah. I don't know. We stopped.